Dwayne Johnson sat alone at a small table by the window in the bustling downtown cafe, hoping to enjoy a tranquil morning before the rest of the city awoke and tore him back into its clutches. The early rays of sunlight poured in through the large glass panes, illuminating the floating dust motes in a gentle golden haze. Outside, the streets were slowly filling with cars and pedestrians, a steady pulse of life that never truly subsided. Inside the cafe, however, a comforting warmth seemed to envelope anyone who entered. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the sugary scent of baked pastries. Soft, cheerful music played overhead, weaving in and out of the hum of casual conversation from other patrons. A few people typed away on laptops, some scrolled through their phones, and others whispered stories over steaming mugs of cappuccino. It was a picturesque slice of city life, and Dwayne wanted nothing more than to sink into its quiet charm. He had slipped inside wearing a hooded sweatshirt that shaded part of his face, hoping to remain incognito for a while. Even when one lived a life defined by headlines and big crowds, there were still moments of precious anonymity to be found in unassuming places. He ordered a simple black coffee, no fuss, no frills, and walked with it to the window seat, setting the paper cup on a table marked by decades of small scratches and worn edges. The gentle hiss of the milk steamer behind the counter accompanied his thoughts, and the low chatter of patrons formed a soothing backdrop that made the cafe feel welcoming and safe. Although the day was cold outside, puffs of white breath streaming from anyone unfortunate enough to be standing too long in the frigid air, inside, the cafe was like a warm cocoon. The sunlight stretched across the tiled floor, and the battered old heating vents kept the chill at bay. Dwayne let himself relax, sipping the hot, slightly bitter coffee and letting the bustle of the city fade into a dull murmur beyond the glass. For once, he was nothing more than another early riser seeking comfort in this small haven. No bright lights, no clamor of an arena, just the soothing lull of normalcy. He reflected on his past in moments like these. Although recognized worldwide for his athletic achievements and subsequent fame, Dwayne was more than the public figure people saw on television or read about on sports news websites. Behind the broad shoulders and the confident gait was a man who appreciated quiet moments of solitude. He had never been the type to seek out violent confrontations. In the ring, controlled aggression had its place. Outside of it, he preferred tranquility and respect. Life had taught him that ego battles on the street never ended well, no matter how skilled one might be. With a strong moral compass and a desire to channel his energy constructively, Dwayne avoided trouble whenever he could. That was why, when he first heard the jarring sound of heavy boots stomping through the cafe entrance, a sense of reluctant resignation tugged at him. He hoped it was just some noisy deliveryman, yet somewhere deep in his chest, he felt the twinge of a coming storm. The shift in atmosphere was almost tangible, like the drop in air pressure before thunder rattled the windows. He continued to sip his coffee, quietly bracing himself for something he couldn't yet name but sensed instinctively. The peace of the cafe, so carefully woven in these early hours, was about to be threatened, and, as fate would have it, he was about to stand in the heart of that potential tempest. The group that entered was 5 men strong, their presence a jarring contrast to the cafe's cozy atmosphere. They were loud, brash, and carried themselves with the swagger of individuals who had never been meaningfully challenged or taught to respect boundaries. Their leader was a tall, wiry man named Vic. His face was etched with a permanent sneer, and his eyes gleamed with a cunning, predatory glint. The rest of the group followed his lead, forming a loose semicircle behind him, like a pack of wolves awaiting a signal from their alpha. Tattoos covered their arms and necks, crude symbols that hinted at affiliations with street gangs and a shared history of intimidation. Their jackets bore patches that signaled trouble, and the aura they exuded was enough to make other patrons shrink slightly in their seats. At first, Dwayne hoped they would simply place an order and leave. After all, bullies usually sought an audience they could impress. But as Vic's eyes scanned the room, searching, dissecting, Dwayne could tell they were looking for a target. A hush seemed to descend over the cafe, though the music still played softly overhead. Waitstaff behind the counter exchanged anxious glances, and a few customers hunched deeper over their cups, trying to appear small and inconspicuous. Anxiety hung in the air, prickling the edges of everyone's awareness. "Check this out," Vic murmured loudly enough to draw attention from several tables. His gaze landed on Dwayne, sizing him up. The tension in his posture spoke of a man who reveled in the chance to prove his dominance. Dwayne kept his eyes on his coffee, hoping to project calm neutrality, but he knew how quickly bullies homed in on any perceived difference or vulnerability. In this case, Dwayne's mere appearance, his broader build, his darker skin, and perhaps the quiet confidence in his posture seemed to spark something ugly in Vic. Colt, Vic's right-hand man, stepped to his leader's side. Colt was stockier than Vic, with a shaved head and menacing tattoos creeping up his neck. He smirked at Dwayne, lips pulling back in a grin that revealed a chipped front tooth. "Looks like we got ourselves a tough one," Colt said, voice tinged with that particular brand of bigotry that instantly turns a peaceful space into a potential battlefield. Several customers turned away, unwilling to watch the confrontation build, but a few, seemingly frozen by morbid curiosity, looked on with wide, anxious eyes. Vic's sneer widened, his voice dripping with provocation. "Tough? I don't know. He's sitting there with his coffee, real quiet. Maybe he's too dumb to know better than to walk into a place like this." The insinuation was painfully obvious. The slur was left unspoken, but everyone could sense its weight in the air. It bristled across the room, a spark landing on tinder, threatening to ignite a larger blaze. The rest of the group, Colt, along with 3 men named Jasper, Rick, and Rex, chuckled cruelly. Dwayne felt his pulse pick up, not from fear, but from the familiar adrenaline that rose whenever danger presented itself. He had encountered men like these in many forms throughout his life, those who thrived on power plays, who saw cruelty as a means to an end, men who responded to difference with hostility and tried to assert their dominance through fear. As a child, Dwayne had learned that sometimes silence was the best shield against a barrage of hateful words. As a trained fighter, he also knew that violence was never the first solution, but sometimes became the last resort when words failed. Even so, he calmly placed his coffee cup down, lifted his gaze to meet Vic's, and said nothing. It was a measured choice, a statement of self-control. Dwayne would not stoop to trading insults, but if they pushed him far enough, he knew exactly how to push back. Sensing rising tension, Beth, the cafe's young waitress, stepped forward with trembling determination. She was small-framed and soft-spoken, her strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail that swayed when she walked. Despite her timid demeanor, she had a protective streak for the place she worked, and she couldn't bear to watch it descend into chaos. Clearing her throat, she spoke in a voice that barely wavered. "Can I help you gentlemen with something? Maybe get you some coffee or pastries?" Her polite smile was forced, but it carried a hint of bravery in the face of an obvious threat. Vic turned on her, the sneer deepening. He looked at Beth with a predator's delight, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "We're fine, sweetheart. We just want to have a conversation with our new friend over there," he said, pointing with his chin toward Dwayne. His words were thick with condescension, and the way he regarded Beth suggested that if he couldn't get to Dwayne, he might just terrorize her or the other staff for fun. Beth's eyes darted toward Dwayne and then back to Vic, her concern practically tangible. She had no illusions about the precarious position she and the other employees were in. "Please," she managed, her tone laced with earnest pleading. "Let's keep this peaceful. We don't want any trouble." In her head, Beth was already planning what she would do if a fight broke out. Call the police, or maybe slip out the side door. Panic fluttered in her stomach, but she remained rooted in place, determined to prevent violence if at all possible. Vic's eyes flicked back to Dwayne. "Well," he replied, the corners of his mouth curling upward in a twisted half-smile, "that depends entirely on him." With a dramatic flourish, he swept his arm in Dwayne's direction, as if presenting some new attraction at a circus. Colt let out a low snigger, and Jasper and Rick exchanged malevolent glances, eager to see how this would unfold. Rex shifted on his feet, glancing around as if looking for an audience, or perhaps the best way to block an exit if Dwayne decided to run. But Dwayne was not going to run. Instead, he glanced at Beth with calm reassurance, then turned his gaze squarely on Vic. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but carried a quiet authority that seemed to resonate in the tense air. "I'm just here for a coffee," he said simply, not a tremor of anger or fear in his tone. "No one needs to get hurt." It was both a plea and a warning, a reminder that he had come in peace, but also an unspoken caveat that he could handle himself if the situation escalated. Vic rolled his shoulders as though loosening up for what he presumed would be a confrontation. He relished these moments, that much was clear, The hateful glint in his eyes shone brighter. "That right?" he asked, feigning surprise. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a guy who walked into the wrong place. You look like the kind of guy who doesn't belong here." His inflection dropped on the word belong, and the rancid stench of racism wafted through the air. A few of the patrons audibly gasped, while others lowered their eyes, hoping not to be singled out next. Beth's gaze flickered anxiously between Dwayne and the intruders, her attempt at peacemaking overshadowed by the intensity of the tension now gripping the cafe. Dwayne inhaled slowly, centering himself as he had been taught to do under pressure. He recognized the signs of a confrontation that would only end one way. His pulse steadied, and in that moment, he felt the swirl of conflicting emotions: anger at the cruelty, pity for the ignorance, and a resolute understanding that he might have no choice but to defend himself and the peace of this establishment. Vic took a menacing step closer, crossing an invisible line of personal space that felt distinctly invasive. Without warning, he reached out and slapped Dwayne's cup, sending it tumbling off the table. Hot coffee splashed onto the floor, and the paper cup rolled away, finally resting near a chair leg. The brazen act reverberated through the cafe like a starter's pistol at a racetrack. Several patrons gasped, while the more skittish among them glanced around for possible escape routes. The cozy hum from moments earlier was replaced by hushed shock and the tense expectation of violence. Beth clapped a hand over her mouth. She looked torn between rushing to clean the mess and running to call the police. Dwayne, for his part, kept his posture relaxed, though every muscle in his body was primed for action. He glanced at the spilled coffee on the floor, then lifted his gaze back to Vic, who wore a triumphant grin that said, "What are you gonna do about it?" Colt chimed in with a mocking laugh. "You see that? Clumsy, clumsy. Never know when these big guys are about to get sloppy." The rest of Vic's crew, Jasper, Rick, and Rex, crowded in closer, hungry for the fight they believed was imminent. Their eyes sparkled with a twisted anticipation, and they fed off each other's aggression like sharks scenting blood in the water. The tension in the cafe had reached a boiling point, and it was obvious that mere words would no longer placate these men. Dwayne stood up slowly. He towered over most people, but with Vic's group, height was only part of the equation. They were prepared to use weapons, cheap shots, intimidation, anything to make sure they emerge victorious. And if that meant crossing racial lines or assaulting innocent bystanders, they seemed more than willing. Dwayne's expression, however, betrayed no sign of intimidation. Instead, it reflected a profound disappointment that it had come to this. Beth, voice trembling, tried one last time to defuse the situation. "Please," she said again, though this time her words sounded more like a desperate whisper than a confident command. "The police will be here in minutes if anyone calls them. Don't do this." Her eyes darted between Dwayne and Vic, silently pleading for cooler heads to prevail. Vic sneered, taking a half step back so he could project his voice through the cafe. "Police? They can show up all they want," he scoffed, brandishing the aura of someone who believed himself above consequences. "We'll be out before they even fill out their forms." His bravado was a performance, but clearly one that had been validated more than once in his life. Then he pointed a dirty finger at Dwayne, the nails chipped and stained. "But this guy right here, he needs to learn a lesson about staying in his lane." In that tense moment, the assembled onlookers sensed that words had reached their limit. Whatever lesson Vic intended to teach, it was one fueled by hate and designed to break someone else's spirit. Dwayne could see the flickers of fear on the faces around him, the elderly couple cowering by the pastry display, the young office worker gripping his to-go cup so tightly it was crushed in his hand, Beth standing there with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. He couldn't allow it to continue. With a calm, measured breath, he readied himself. If these men wanted to fight, it wouldn't be Dwayne's choice, but he had no intention of letting them terrorize this cafe or harm anyone in it. The line had been drawn, and now it was only a matter of time before violence shattered the last vestiges of this morning's quiet peace. The tension snapped like a frayed wire. Colt lunged first, spurred on by the twisted glee of inflicting damage. He aimed a wild, swinging punch at Dwayne's head, something more indicative of barroom brawls than of disciplined combat. But Dwayne, with honed reflexes from countless hours in the ring and a lifetime of training, dipped smoothly to the side. The blow sailed past him, hitting nothing but air and sending Colt off balance. Dwayne retaliated with a short, powerful jab that cracked into Colt's nose. A wet crunch followed by a howl of pain told everyone in the cafe just how solid the impact had been. Colt stumbled backward, clutching his face as blood dribbled between his fingers. Jasper and Rick, their eyes now wild, rushed forward to avenge their wounded comrade. Jasper grabbed a chair, swinging it in a wide arc at Dwayne's torso. Dwayne stepped inward rather than away, reducing the chair's momentum and redirecting its force. Then he twisted his hips and delivered a punishing blow to Jasper's midsection. Jasper collapsed to his knees, the chair clattering to the floor, air whooshing out of his lungs like a deflated balloon. Rick, meanwhile, tried to tackle Dwayne around the waist, hoping brute strength could overwhelm him. Dwayne braced himself, planting his feet, and brought both elbows down across Rick's back with a punishing force. Rick let out a choked groan, losing his grip. With an economy of movement, Dwayne shifted his weight and tossed Rick aside, sending him sprawling into a nearby table. The table shattered under Rick's weight, plates and mugs crashing noisily to the floor, shards of porcelain skittering in all directions. Vic watched his men flounder, shock and anger warring on his face. This was not the easy conquest he had envisioned. Gritting his teeth, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a foldable blade. The flash of metal in the cafe's soft light drew gasps from the crowd. Beth let out a frightened yelp, and a few customers flinched back, covering their mouths in horror. "You messed with the wrong group," Vic growled, flipping the blade open with a practiced flick of his wrist. A knot of fear and adrenaline formed in Dwayne's gut at the sight of the weapon. He was no stranger to danger, but knives introduced an entirely new level of risk. Still, panic was never an ally in combat. Keeping his breath steady, he tracked Vic's movements. The thug leader lunged, slashing at Dwayne's midsection. Dwayne pivoted sharply, the edge of the blade narrowly missing him. Vic pressed his advantage, attempting another slash aimed higher this time, but Dwayne parried the arm with the back of his forearm, deflecting the blow just enough to avoid being cut. Seizing the opening, Dwayne clamped his hand around Vic's wrist, forcing the knife away. With a swift, powerful twist, he disarmed the thug, sending the blade clattering onto the floor next to the broken dishes. Before Vic could react, Dwayne hammered a fist into his ribs, a blow so solid it sounded like a muffled drumbeat echoing through the cafe. Vic staggered, the wind knocked from his lungs. He gasped, dropping to one knee with a wheeze that signaled he'd never expected this level of retaliation. For a heartbeat, the cafe was filled with nothing but the panting breath of the aggressors and the stunned hush of everyone witnessing the fight. The message was clear. The bullies had gravely underestimated the quiet man they had chosen to terrorize. Rex, the last of Vic's gang still standing, looked momentarily uncertain. He cast a rapid glance at his injured cohorts. Colt was half-conscious and bleeding from his nose. Jasper was gasping for air on his hands and knees. Rick lay among the remnants of a shattered table, and Vic was kneeling, clutching his side. Rex's expression flickered from hesitation to fury. He let out a guttural roar, apparently deciding to go all in rather than slink away. He lunged toward Dwayne, arms raised in a reckless attempt to tackle him to the floor, but Dwayne sidestepped neatly. Planting his foot, Dwayne swung a devastating hook that connected squarely with Rex's jaw. The impact lifted Rex off his feet, sending him crashing onto his back. Throughout the cafe, people were either riveted in place or huddled in the corners, trying to stay clear of the violence. A few of the braver souls had pulled out phones to record or call for help. The collective realization was that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Dwayne Johnson was not just a large, imposing figure. He was someone who moved with the lethal grace of a trained professional. He had dispatched the gang with both precision and restraint, a combination that suggested deep experience in handling more than mere everyday squabbles. As the last thug hit the floor, a hush descended. The frantic energy that had ricocheted through the cafe dissipated, leaving behind a stunned silence. Dwayne surveyed the aftermath. Shattered ceramics littered the floor, pools of spilled coffee and splashes of blood, forming a grim mosaic across the once pristine tiles. Tables and chairs lay overturned, and the air hung thick with the sharp tang of adrenaline and fear. Yet, for all the destruction, it could have been worse. None of the cafe's regular patrons seemed badly hurt. The real damage lay solely among the aggressors. Vic tried to stand, propping himself against an upturned chair while clutching his ribs. He glared at Dwayne, furious humiliation painting his expression. You're gonna pay for this," he spat, though the words sounded hollow and desperate. Even as he said them, his voice wavered, robbed of the confidence he had displayed earlier. The facade of an untouchable bully was cracking, revealing a person not nearly as invincible as he wanted the world to believe. Beth, stepping out from behind the counter where she had taken momentary cover, cautiously approached Dwayne. Her face was pale, yet her eyes gleamed with relief and astonishment. Are you okay?" she asked, voice trembling at the edges. She was still processing the sudden eruption of violence and the fact that this one man had stopped a brutal group assault from taking a far worse turn. Dwayne nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Yeah," he replied, breathing heavily but otherwise appearing remarkably composed. "I'm not hurt, just sorry about the mess." He gestured to the shattered chairs, the puddles of spilled coffee, the broken plates. It looked like a small war had taken place. Dwayne's eyes flicked over the battered men groaning on the ground. There was no triumph in his gaze, just a resigned acceptance that the fight had been necessary. He understood this outcome had been forced upon him. It wasn't a moment he had sought or desired, despite what Vic and his crew might believe. The cafe remained deathly quiet, patrons still in shock over the speed and intensity of the encounter. At last, an older man at a nearby table uttered a shaky, "Thank you." Another voice chimed in with, "You saved us." A wave of murmured gratitude swept through the room, and a weight seemed to lift, replaced by a mixture of relief and awe. Dwayne offered a small, tired smile, acknowledging their words but not basking in them. He had done what he felt was right. Nothing more, nothing less. One by one, the gang members struggled to their feet, or at least tried to. Rick managed to stumble upright, leaning heavily on the remains of the splintered table. Jasper and Rex crawled closer to Colt, still whimpering through his broken nose. Vic finally staggered up as well, rage plastered on his face. Though each movement drew a sharp hiss of pain, he swept the cafe with a venomous gaze, as though the onlookers were responsible for his embarrassment instead of his own vile behavior. Despite the obvious injuries, his arrogance flickered to life again when he spotted the cell phones some patrons were holding. He spat on the floor, a gesture of disdain and frustration, his chest heaving with labored breaths. "You all saw it," he barked, gesturing wildly at Dwayne with a trembling hand. "He attacked us. He's the animal." The claim was laughable under the circumstances. Half the crowd had witnessed his harassment firsthand. Cameras had likely captured more than enough proof of who instigated the brawl. Still, Vic clung to his narrative of victimhood, as bullies often do when they're confronted with their own failings. It was a last-ditch attempt to rewrite reality on the spot. A few patrons scoffed, others simply glared. Beth stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly over her chest in an almost protective gesture. "No one here is going to support your lies," she stated, her voice uncharacteristically firm. The morning's events had given her courage that surprised even her. "You and your friends came in and started this. We all saw what happened." Her eyes cut to Dwayne, who stood silently, hands at his sides, posture no longer tense in anticipation of violence. "He saved us from you." Vic looked ready to spew more vitriol, but Rick tugged on his jacket sleeve. "Come on, man," Rick muttered, his voice quivering. "Let's just go." Jasper and Rex nodded, both sporting bruises and battered egos. This was a lost cause, and even they could see it. Vic resisted for a moment, rage still burning in his eyes, but the reality of his predicament began to sink in. Whatever imagined victory he'd hoped for was long gone. The front door of the cafe swung open, and two men in police uniforms appeared in the doorway. Their arrival hadn't been heralded by sirens. Likely it was a foot patrol or a quick response to silent alarms from local establishments. They glanced around, taking in the ruined tables, the bloodied faces, and the ashen looks on the patrons' faces. One officer, a tall man with a short mustache, placed his hand on his holstered weapon, scanning for immediate threats. The other, shorter but stocky and grim-faced, stepped forward to gauge the situation. "Everyone remain calm," he said, raising a hand in what was meant to be a soothing gesture. "We received a report of a disturbance." Immediately, half a dozen voices rose to explain, pointing at Vic and his gang. Some recounted the racial slurs, the intimidation, the physical assault. Others just shouted, "They started it!" in angry unison. The officers directed the battered thugs to stand aside, checking them for concealed weapons, eventually retrieving Vic's knife from the floor. The men's surly expressions hinted that they were ready to blame Dwayne for everything, but the presence of multiple recording phones and the unison testimony of the eyewitnesses shattered that possibility. There would be no easy escape from the consequences of their actions. Dwayne watched quietly, offering no resistance when one of the officers approached him for a statement. He answered in calm, concise sentences, recounting how he had been sitting there quietly before he was harassed, threatened, and forced to defend himself. The officer eyed him carefully, studying the discrepancy between Dwayne's unscathed appearance and the battered forms of the gang members. But every patron's story aligned with Dwayne's. The shortest officer eventually nodded, stepping back to take notes, while the tall, mustached one addressed Vic and his crew with a no-nonsense stare. "We have enough to arrest all of you," he said, eyebrows arching in disapproval. "Don't even think about resisting." While the police sorted out the immediate details, collecting statements, confiscating the knife, recording witness testimonies, Dwayne glanced around the cafe. Furniture lay overturned or broken, and shards of porcelain crunched underfoot whenever anyone took a step. The once welcoming aroma of coffee now mingled with the metallic tang of blood and the stale reek of fear-laced sweat. He felt a wave of regret settle in his chest. Although he'd done nothing wrong, it was still unsettling to see so much havoc in a place meant for peaceful gatherings. Beth approached him with cautious steps, her ponytail swishing with each movement. In her hands, she clutched a damp cloth, a token attempt at cleaning up the splattered coffee. I'm sorry this happened," she said, her voice softer now that the threat of violence was subsiding. She seemed unsure how to address someone who had just so thoroughly dismantled 5 men. Still, her gratitude and concern shone through. "Thank you for stepping in. I think a lot of people could have been hurt if you hadn't." He offered a small nod of acknowledgement, a faint smile on his lips. "I didn't want any trouble," he replied truthfully. "I just couldn't let them bully everyone." The memory of Vic's sneer and the way he wielded that slur like a weapon still churned in Dwayne's stomach. The confrontation felt inevitable the moment those men had spotted him. Yet what lingered with him more was the relief that no innocent bystanders had been seriously hurt. The older couple who had witnessed the fight from the pastry display gave Dwayne anxious but grateful looks. A few of the younger patrons gathered the courage to voice their appreciation, stammering thanks. Some tried to hide their awe, while others made no attempt at subtlety, whispering that they had recognized him or at least suspected who he might be. "I've seen him on TV," one whispered to her friend, eyes wide as saucers. Another mouthed, "Is that really who I think it is?" But Dwayne tried not to engage with their curiosity. He had endured enough public attention in his lifetime. It never ended well to feed that particular fire. Meanwhile, the officers were busy lining up Vic's crew, their hateful stares locking on Dwayne from time to time. The entire group looked deflated, like balloons popped at a party, leaving nothing but a deflated rubber husk on the ground. Their big talk about how they were beyond the law had crumbled into silent resentment. Some coughed, others winced, and Vic cradled his ribcage, likely bruised if not cracked. The police read them their rights as they prepared to lead them out. One of the men muttered curses under his breath, earning him a reprimand from the tall officer. Dwayne heaved a quiet sigh. He knew that, in time, these men might be back on the streets, possibly embittered by what had happened today. Hatred, when deeply rooted, wasn't easily uprooted by a single defeat. But maybe, just maybe, this incident would make them think twice before lashing out again. If not out of moral reconsideration, then out of fear of encountering a more powerful force. The cyclical nature of violence weighed heavily on Dwayne's mind. Too many times he'd seen the vicious loop continue, but all he could do was handle the moment in front of him. Beth touched his arm gently, pulling him from his thoughts. "We'll need a statement from you. The officers will probably ask for your personal information. Is that okay?" She bit her lip as though worried he might vanish, unwilling to remain entangled in a police matter. But Dwayne merely nodded. As much as he disliked the inconvenience and potential publicity, he knew it was the right thing to do. He would face the consequences of his actions, though he believed wholeheartedly he had done the necessary thing to protect innocent people. Time stretched while the officers finished their work, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky and lending an odd clarity to the wreckage within the cafe. Each overturned chair, every drop of blood on the tile, and every shattered piece of porcelain seemed etched in sharp relief. There was a surreal quality to the aftermath. The cafe patrons who remained felt as if they were waking from a collective nightmare. The final waves of adrenaline ebbed, leaving trembling hands and uneasy sighs in their wake. Eventually, after collecting witness accounts and reviewing footage captured by cell phones, the officers escorted Vic and his men out. The group trudged in a pathetic line, their initial bravado beaten down by reality, occasionally throwing dark glares over their shoulders. The door swung shut behind them, and the tension in the cafe loosened, as though someone had cut a taut wire. A smattering of applause rose among the braver patrons, a show of respect for Dwayne, even though he hadn't sought any ovation. He acknowledged the gesture with a brief nod, but made no attempt to linger in the spotlight. Beth sighed heavily, relief mingling with exhaustion. "That was intense," she murmured, surveying the damages. Then she turned to Dwayne, her expression morphing into one of sheepish hesitation. "I know you're not responsible for all this, but the cafe—" She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the broken chairs, the ruined dishes, and the coffee-soaked floors. It would take a concerted effort and some expense to repair the damage. Insurance might cover some of it, but small businesses often struggled with claims and deductibles. Dwayne's gaze followed hers, taking in the battered remains of what should have been a peaceful morning. Though he had no legal obligation to compensate for damages caused by the gang's violence, his conscience tugged at him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sizable fold of cash, the result of a series of personal errands he had planned for the day. Wordlessly, he stepped toward the counter and placed it there, gently pressing it under the little dish that normally held customer receipts. The gesture was quiet, unassuming, an unspoken apology and an expression of gratitude for the cafe's staff and the community that had embraced him, if only for a moment. Beth looked on with wide eyes, clearly taken aback. "I can't possibly accept all that," she protested, voice trembling. "You're not the one who destroyed our property. You shouldn't—" He raised a hand to gently cut her off. "Please, use it to cover the repairs," Dwayne said in a soft tone that left little room for argument. "If there's anything extra, keep it. You work hard here. This place deserves to get back on its feet without delay." Though tears welled in her eyes, Beth nodded, swallowing her protests. She recognized the sincerity in his offer, and deep down, she knew the cafe needed it. "Thank you," she managed, her voice cracking. Satisfied that the cafe staff would have the resources to recover, Dwayne took one last look around. The battered tables and scattered debris spoke volumes about what had just happened. Despite the destruction, a sense of community lingered, people whispering kind words to each other, faces showing relief that, in the end, they were safe. Dwayne inclined his head to the patrons as he walked toward the door. Outside, the city was fully awake now. The crisp air braced him as he stepped from the warmth of the cafe into the busy street, traffic humming in the distance. Glancing over his shoulder, he could see Beth and a few patrons peering at him through the window, a mixture of gratitude and wonder written on their faces. A lifetime of fame had taught Dwayne not to dwell on public recognition. Instead, he breathed in the cold morning air and moved on, quietly hoping that his actions had done some good, and that the next time such bullies appeared, they would think twice before turning a peaceful haven into a battlefield of hate. As he disappeared into the urban sprawl, the cafe and its inhabitants began the slow work of cleaning up, sweeping away broken glass, mopping coffee, righting overturned chairs. But no one who had witnessed the events of that morning would forget the swift, disciplined ferocity with which Dwayne Johnson had protected them. Nor would they forget the quiet humility he displayed after the fact. In a world so often marred by apathy or aggression, his choice to stand up for others was a reminder that kindness and courage can share the same moment, and that sometimes the line separating peaceful days from waking nightmares can be redrawn by a single person who refuses to bow to hatred.